Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Alex. Today I want to talk to you guys about a recap of Altered Carbon Season 1. So the new season has been out for a little over a week or so now, and I've been super enjoying it so far. And if you like Blade Runner, then you may very well like Altered Carbon. So we're going to talk about that a little bit, and then towards the end, we're going to talk about a weird sci-fi dream that I recently had, and how the moon can actually affect people's moods. Alright, so we are first going to start out with Altered Carbon. So if you haven't seen this show before, it is based on a 2002 cyberpunk novel by a British writer named Richard K. Morgan. The concept of the book is that it's set in the future and interstellar travel is now available to people by transferring your consciousness between bodies. That is very similar in principle to transfer transit in dark matter, and I think that that is super cool. In Travelers, it is through space-time, so it's not just across space, but across time itself, going back to different points. In the Altered Carbon universe, we're mostly following Takeshi Kovacs. So Takeshi Kovacs was an elite soldier and then essentially a private investigator / mercenary who had a rough time growing up and then was made to be kind of an elite, like super soldier in a way. It's kind of special forces training. So there's a lot going on in Altered Carbon. So first off, I want to just inform you guys of the terminology real quickly if you are not familiar with it. So the whole principle of Altered Carbon is that the interplanetary travel, really, has been made available via being able to transfer your consciousness. But where is that consciousness stored? So it's stored in a cortical stack, or just called a stack a lot of times in the show. And your cortical stack is this alien device that you implant in your spinal column, and that houses your true consciousness. And something that really harkens back to an Our Lord Ford type of mechanism from Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, they also refer to the stack and its housing of the true self as being the digital human freight, or DHF. So the essence of who you are as a human is stored digitally in pretty much a server bank, and then you can download it or upload it across space into different stacks. So it's stored kind of like in a cloud, more or less, and then you can go ahead and download it into another stack, into another body. So you can kind of think of this as being the brain or the mind or your consciousness in general. All of the components that are you are in this stack, including essentially the concept of your soul, if you believe in that. In addition to the stack, so the stack is the part that houses who you are. So it's a little disc. It's, a little bit larger than I'd say a $50 in the US, a silver $50, and about 3 times as thick as one. And it's silver and blue. It looks pretty cool. But you house that in a sleeve. So the sleeve is the body. It's the meat sack that you are transferring your consciousness into. So you can download that digital human freight, your consciousness, into a body via getting that DHF downloaded into the stack and inserting that into the sleeve. And that means you can be in whatever type of body that you want. You are not limited by sex or ancestry or anything like that. You can have a very highly customizable look. And it makes flesh seem more disposable because you can just re-sleeve a consciousness as long as your stack has not been destroyed. If your DHF is housed inside of that stack at the time and someone destroys your stack, then you get real death, is what we call it here. You are completely dead unless you are what they call a meth. So in this case, it's not about methamphetamines. It's from the Bible figure Methuselah, who was supposed to be super old. If you've ever heard of the expression older than Methuselah, that's what they're talking about. So in this case, they have come up with a slang term called meths, and these are super, super duper rich people, like bajillionaires, who can pretty much live forever by cloning their own sleeves. So they can clone their own bodies and then just keep transferring their stacks into those sleeves. They can also have a remote storage backup of their DHF. So even if someone blows out their cortical stack and they have what would otherwise be real death for people of moderate to modest means, for them, they can just spin up their stack into another sleeve via their backup. So that's pretty interesting to me. And a lot of them have their backups backed up every 24 hours or so. Kind of like how Time Machine on your MacBook decides it wants to go ahead and back stuff up all the time, but most of us don't actually follow through with that. My bad. So in this case, we have stacks, your consciousness, sleeves, your meat sack, your body. A synthetic sleeve can also be made, and those are called synths. Needle casting is the process of putting your consciousness into a sleeve. And the original purpose of that was just to allow for interstellar travel, just like in dark matter, where you get put into a synthetic body. And in dark matter, the synthetic body gets reprocessed. So it's recycled in a way within, I think they said like 4 days or so of you using it, if I recall that properly. 4 hours, something like that. Gonna have to watch it again. But it's very interesting in that regard. It reminds me a little bit of surrogates as well in that way. Although in surrogates, your synthetic sleeve, it takes a lot of money to purchase them. They're highly customizable and you can get them to look any way you want. But they are more like you're just going out in the world and you can just jump off of a bridge and get another one if you're rich enough. So the other terms that we need to know to really discuss altered carbon are going to be envoy. So an envoy is like Takeshi Kovacs. He's like a super soldier, and some of them are allied with different groups. A lot of people think of them as terrorists, and others consider them to be freedom fighters. So that's just like in the real world where one person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist. That just all depends on perspective. And like Obi-Wan Kenobi says, everything is true from a certain point of view. So these folks who are called envoys are amazing fighters, and they are very skilled at using technology. Takeshi Kovacs and the other envoys were led in the past by a woman of color named Kelchrist Falconer. And so people follow Kelchrist, Kel, as Takeshi usually calls her. And she is really just talking about how they don't think that it's natural for people to live forever, and that they don't think that it is healthy in any sociocultural way either. And in that way, it really reminds me of the concept of rituals of rebellion that we've discussed in the past. But we'll circle back to that here in a little bit. So in this regard, the last thing we need to know here is Dipper And dippers hack into needle casting and sell people's memories on the black market. They're dipping into people's minds and taking these memories to sell on the black market for folks. And wedges, or the wedge, is a mercenary organization that we have at a certain point. You're only supposed to do certain things with sleeves. Other things are illegal, so you can't have more than one consciousness from the same person spun up at the same time. We call it spinning up when you are taking someone who was previously not conscious and putting them into another body and then spinning someone back down. So in the altered carbon universe, a lot of times people will be spun down in order to go through like their version of prison, where they just essentially take you out of your body, out of your sleeve, even if it's your original natural one, and they'll put you what they call on ice, so just no consciousness really, for a long time until you've served your prison sentence. And that's where we come in season 1 with Takeshi Kovacs, is he has been caught and has been spun down for about 300 years. All right, we're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to deep dive into season 1 of Altered Carbon. Stay tuned.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
About the basic premise of Altered Carbon being based on a 2002 cyberpunk novel, the setting of the show, as well as some terminology we'll need in order to be able to really discuss the show in depth. Alright, so now we're going to go ahead and proceed with our recap of Season 1. So, in Season 1, the envoy, the super soldier, Takeshi Kovacs, wakes up in a new body after having been spun down for 250 years for a bunch of criminal convictions that were associated with him being an envoy. Now, the envoys that are led by Kelchrist Falconer are really very well trained in combat and in tech. They can re-sleeve very easily as well. They, remember, what started out as being interstellar travel, so the sleeving process can be a little jarring at first too, because you are in a different body. Your body looks different from how you look. Whereas in dark matter, then you're going to still be able to have a body that looks like yours. And you also have that option in surrogates as well. But seeing yourself in the mirror for the first time as someone who has recently been sleeved into a new body can be very, very jarring. You have memories and everything waking up. And if you have previously been killed in a certain manner, so not real death because your stack is still available to be re-sleeved, but you have been shot or stabbed and resulted in you needing a new sleeve, that can also be super jarring as you wake up and that is the last memory that you have. So the whole process can be very disorienting. But envoys and other types of super soldiers are trained to re-sleeve a lot. They're trained to be able to jump from sleeve to sleeve, more or less, and be up and ready to go, like combat ready, and be entirely in control of their cognitive functioning within minutes. So they're very elite in that manner. We see in the first episode when Kovacs is spun back up, that he is like, he just immediately wants to see a mirror And he's been spun down for 250 years. So he is very freaked out about what's going on. He doesn't know what year it is. He's just been essentially unconscious for this entire time. And he wants to see the new body he's in. And you're not supposed to show the folks who are recently re-sleeved a mirror or any reflective surfaces. The rooms that they hold them in are specifically treated to not have reflective surfaces because they don't want people to freak out. You know, people are panicky and dangerous when they are going through something that is new and they're super confused. It's like what Kay says to Jay in Men in Black. A person is smart. People are panicky, dangerous animals. So you want to make sure that you're very careful here. And we see exactly why that is the rule when Takeshi Kovacs wakes up. And he is essentially a murder machine. And he is just coming to. He's super freaked out. He doesn't know what's happening. He's been unconscious for so long. And the last thing that he remembers is seeing his sleeve partner gunned down and having to deal with someone from his past hunting him and her down. So, in that regard, he's not having a great reawakening period. He's a little bit rusty at this point from 250 years of being spun down, but his instincts are definitely still there. And he beats the crap out of a bunch of these scientists in this room until one of them finally gives him a reflective tray so that he can see his face. And we see his mind kind of trying to process what's happening. I like that they really address that in Altered Carbon because I imagine that would be exceptionally jarring. It's not jarring for the folks in Dark Matter because the sleeve that they're in looks and operates just like their bodies would have before. It looks exactly like a copy of them because it is. It's a synthetic sleeve at that point that is then just composted afterwards. I think that that's super fascinating and I like how the two different shows approach that. But in the case of Altered Carbon, you are stuck with this organic sleeve. This is somebody else's body at this point, and this person may have died in a super terrible way, so they had real death, but their body is still usable, stuff like that. But you won't necessarily get a great body when you come back. So we see that in the very beginning of this, in which Kovacs has a really great body, someone who's in really good shape. He's tall, he's buff, and he is someone who is accustomed to fighting. Whereas one of the other people who's sitting there in this almost therapy session, part intro session of, you know, hey, you're in a new body now. This is what's going on. They're getting this information from a hologram because, again, they're a little unstable and panicky at this point. But they're being told what's going on. And you see this one older lady really upset and confused. And then you see that older lady meet these two younger people out front where everyone is waiting for their loved ones. And she's just like, Mom, Dad. And you find out that this is like a 9-year-old girl who was killed and they implanted her in an older lady's body because they couldn't afford to have a specific type of body like for a younger person. I really enjoy the socioeconomic aspect of that. That is very much how I think that the U.S. at least would deal with this in the future. I've seen firsthand how we treat paupers' graves and how we treat the graves of people who are undocumented immigrants who die at the Texas-Mexico border. And it's not great, you guys. A lot of folks are just buried in, I've seen freight boxes, like shipping boxes, people in milk crates, people in body bags. And I very much think that if we were to have this type of sleeving process, that folks who could not afford to, specify really what they needed would get something traumatic, like putting a little girl in an older woman's body. Like this lady is supposed to be like in her 50s or so, I think. And the poor kid is just super absolutely freaked out. And it's kind of an ethical nightmare, which is partly where Chris Falconer and the envoys are coming from when they're going, hey, this isn't natural, this isn't good. So even though a lot of folks consider Falconer and her followers to be terrorists because they are trying to stop the use of sleeving, we also see that there are a lot of ethical implications in this show. And it's all very twisted and interesting. So there are some great concepts for this where you can go, hey, if a person has been murdered, then we can spin them back up as long as their stack isn't destroyed, and we can ask them who killed them and hold people to task for what they've done to make sure that people are incarcerated and punished for their crimes. And that's a really cool concept. But you also have a lot of people in this case who are saying that's not worth it in the long term, and prolonging human life in this manner is absolutely not natural. And since it is not natural, it should not be performed. So there are different factions that are having different beliefs. And we see that echoed in similarities from human life right now, where we have folks who are pro-women's rights and people who are anti-women's rights, or in other terms, pro-women's right to abortion and anti-women's rights to abortion. Similarly, but to a lesser degree, we see that occurring also in the U.S. today with the right to die. So folks who are terminally ill and who would like to select humane euthanasia, but are not allowed to outside of certain states like Oregon. So I really enjoy this aspect of the show. It is a little underplayed in some aspects, but I think that it's more understated than anything, and that is something I really enjoy in writing. So it's not super expositional. We get to go in depth with it, but they show us instead of telling us in a lot of ways. So we see these protesters as Takeshi Kovacs and the other folks who've recently had their stacks spun up and re-sleeved walking out of this hospital area, and there's protesters on both sides about it, saying that this isn't natural, and other folks being like, leave them alone. They are just people who've been through something horrible and they're traumatized, so you need to cut them some slack. I think it's super interesting, and I love seeing these types of ideals and ideological disagreements that we have today reflected in this strange cyberpunk future. We're going to go on another break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about what happens to Takeshi Kovacs as he leaves this facility. Stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
About people getting spun up and what that really looks like in the world of altered carbon, who has rights to different types of bodies, and how paupers or the poor are really treated in this aspect, as well as the sociocultural ideologies that are competing in regards to whether it's moral or ethical for folks to be spun back up. I think it's a really fascinating concept, and we really see how Takeshi feels about this as time goes on. So as he's leaving this facility, other folks are met by their loved ones, but he is met by someone named Ortega, Lieutenant Kristen Ortega, who is telling him she's there to pick him up for the person who has paid for him to be spun back up. The person who's paid to spin him back up is a super wealthy meth named Lawrence Bancroft, who wants Takeshi Kovacs to solve his own murder. So Lawrence Bancroft was murdered, but not with real death, because he had a backup, DHF, because he's so rich, but he wants to know who killed him. And Ortega says she's there to take Takeshi Kovacs up to Bancroft. Now, in regards to Takeshi being spun back up, Bancroft paid a lot of money to do that because Takeshi's overall time served was not finished at all. He had murdered so many people and had been arrested by folks who considered him to be a terrorist, although he considered himself to be a freedom fighter, and wants to go ahead and go back to sleep. He's like, I don't want to help this rich dude with his stuff. Just spin me back down for the rest of my prison sentence. I don't care. And it's very interesting how he approaches this. So he is taken up to Bancroft, who lives way up in the sky above the clouds, and Ortega tells Takeshi Kovacs that that's because a lot of the meths don't want to have to deal with seeing the poverty and everything else, the chaos that goes on down below. So in that regard, he is already kind of not enjoying himself. He's pretty reticent, but he's getting to know Ortega a little bit. So she crashes their flying car into the facility at Bancroft's, and Takeshi's like, what is happening? Something is super off. But he goes to the Bancroft mansion and starts talking to Lawrence Bancroft. He decides he doesn't want anything to do with him, but Bancroft also gives him a book that Chris Falconer had written prior to her death. And she has died somewhere between Takeshi being spun down and being spun back up. So he's not exactly sure what's happened to Kel, but you can tell that he had some type of strong feelings about her in a very positive manner because he's holding on to that book very sentimentally, which he's not showing any form of sentimentality or attachment to anything else at this point, including life and consciousness. So Lawrence Bancroft tells him, you'll have your freedom and I will offer you a ton of money to solve this problem for me. People think that I committed suicide, but clearly, I didn't. Why would I do that? I'm super rich and I have backups. So there's that, but whoever killed me did it, right before my backup, my 24-hour backup was supposed to occur. So we don't know what happened. I don't have those memories. So he's like, go think about it. And Kovacs goes back down to, planet side and checks into a hotel ran by a holographic AI named Poe, who's supposed to look like Edgar Allan Poe. Poe is my favorite character. I love him so much. A lot of folks don't stay in AI hotels in the world of Altered Carbon anymore because the AI hotels are really, really protective. And as Kristen and them put it, Ortega and them, they say that they act like jealous girlfriends. So I think it's really interesting how that works. And when some people come in there to kill Kovacs just because of who he is, they call him the last envoy because the others have disappeared or died since he was last around 250 years ago because they also don't believe in living forever. So they come after him, and when they do, he can handle himself pretty well, but he doesn't really have any weapons right now, just a backpack full of drugs as he's decided to just go do a bunch of drugs in this AI hotel. But Poe tells him, go ahead and sign, and I can offer you full amenities. So Kovacs does, and we really see what Poe is fully capable of. It is hilarious, but also pretty hardcore. And I really enjoy this character. He's quirky and also just does whatever he has to do to try to keep his guests happy. And Takeshi is his only guest at this point. So as the season goes on, we see that Ortega is keeping track of Kovac. She doesn't really trust him, and she especially doesn't trust him because he's an envoy and he's associating with the meth Lawrence Bancroft. She was also in charge of the Bancroft investigation when it was originally opened, the murder investigation, and she's like, he had to have killed himself, essentially. No one else could have gone in there at that point. So at that point, Bancroft really started kind of blackballing Ortega and is just really rude to her in general. There's a ton of animosity, and she is, one of those smart mouth cops, and I really enjoy seeing that particular character type on screen. So we get to see a lot of Ortega and her partner. That's pretty cool. And we learned that Kovac's current sleeve is Ortega's former lover and a disgraced cop. So he and Ortega go to interrogate a sort of gangster who runs an underground cage fighting ring, and Kovac ends up coming face to face with his old sleeve there, but it's stored in a tube for use in like gladiator battles, which is really fascinating how they have really repurposed his sleeve into being like this symbol of, just being a hardcore warrior as well. I think it would be really weird to know that you're really BA, but also to wake up 250 years later in a different body and then see your original body being used to put other people's consciousness into for hardcore fights. So we see him and Ortega see this body, and then later Ortega gets really badly wounded in a fight, and she gets a mechanical prosthetic arm. Then we see that Kovac learns that Lawrence's son, Isaac, might have been responsible for the murder, and he and Ortega are kidnapped and forced to fight in the arena. So Kovac's sister, Raylene, arrives to save them at that point. And this is where a series of flashbacks begins. I'm a big fan of flashback usage in stories. That's also why I really enjoy the method of watching Star Wars in machete order. If you're going to sit down with somebody and watch the whole series for the first time through, in order to really see it from the perspective of Luke's story, instead of this mishmash of Luke's story and Anakin's stories. Although I love both, I like to watch them in release order as well. But if I'm watching it with a new person, someone who hasn't seen it for the first time yet, I like to do machete order. So 4, 5, 2, 3, and then 6. You don't really have to watch episode 1 for it, but you can if you want after 5 and before 2. And Rogue One isn't really necessary at all in that manner for it. Neither is the Han Solo movie. So I just don't bother with those unless they want to watch supplementary movies later on. It's the show don't tell method that I am so fond of, and that is what Altered Carbon does as well. So it begins a series of flashbacks a few episodes in so that we see who Takeshi Kovac was 250 years ago and therefore who he still is at his heart today. All right, we're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to pick up through the series of flashbacks and the interstellar training of Kel and their missions.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
we're talking about the basic principles of altered carbon in Season 1 and where Kovacs gets to up to the series of flashbacks, and how that is very similar to the storytelling method of the hero's journey of Luke Skywalker when you view Star Wars in machete order. So in these flashbacks, we see Kovacs remembering his past with his sister and his training with Kel Chris Falconer, the missions they went on as envoys, and details about his personal life and his former life in general. Right now in the present, he knows that Kel is the revolutionary leader and the original creator of the stacks, but he also learns that his sister is not necessarily who she appears to be. So a lot of Takeshi's life was based around his sister. We know that the entire fact that he started joining in a military group is due to the fact that his father was constantly beating his sister and him and his mother, and he finally had enough of it as a child and killed his father after their father had killed their mother and was taking everything out on his sister. So he had to leave his whole life behind to keep her safe, and was told that she would be put into a very safe home with a good family. But instead, she was given to the Yakuza. So the sister that he was trying to protect ends up being just as good at killing people as he is at this point, but she was trained by a criminal syndicate, whereas he was initially trained by a military group before they both found each other again and joined the envoys. So I really enjoy seeing this in these flashbacks, how they see each other for the first time and recognize each other because they are both trained to have fine attention to detail, in addition to also being able to kill people very, very well. They're very skilled at that. But we see that Kel originally created the stacks, but then later found that the way that people were using them was not ethical or moral in her perspective. So it's a very common tale as old as time, if you will, in which a scientist has created something to make the world a better place, and it is instead weaponized in a way and used to further widen the gap in socioeconomic status in particular, and to increase certain groups' amount of power and access. So in this regard, Kel has decided that her original purpose is not really being seen, and this is being abused. So she needs to make sure that she stops it before further marginalization of people occurs. I really enjoy the usage of Kel, and I love that she is a woman of color as well. So she's not only a brilliant scientist and an amazing fighter, but she has this deep moral and ethical conviction at her heart as well. In a way, she reminds me of Sam Carter, but a little more hardcore, or a lot more hardcore in that way, because Carter would still create the Naquadah reactors and stuff to kill people when she needed to, and on very large scales. She blew up a sun, for crying out loud. But at the same time, Carter did have a good heart, and even when she did things that she felt were wrong, like betraying Fifth, the replicator, she felt terrible about it, and she took responsibility for it. And that is essentially also what Kel is doing in this case. She made something that was meant to be great, and it's now being used for something terrible. Much like how Carter's Naquadah reactors were initially meant to provide enough energy to be used to power gates and to be used on certain missions for essentially an electricity replacement. But it is ultimately used as another form of a nuke, which has happened to physicists many times throughout time. It's also happened to biologists and chemists in bioweapons engineering. So this is really fascinating to me in this aspect, and we don't sit here and watch her create these stacks initially. We just know that she made them, and she feels that now we have to kind of backpedal in a way. And she's going to do that by any means possible. So there is also a Malcolm X type of component in here. And I really enjoy how well-rounded Kel Chris Falconer is as a character. Even though the show is following Takeshi Kovacs, Kel plays a ginormous part in this, even if we don't get to first meet her really until a few episodes in. And even then, it's in these flashbacks. So as we get to this point and we see these flashbacks, we see how Takeshi Kovacs and his sister Ray go ahead and meet the Kel Chris Falconer group, the Falconers, the envoys, and how they begin their training with them, with Ray being a lot more reluctant than Takeshi to join them. Neither of them were entirely jazzed about it, but they're running from the Yakuza and from the Protectorate at that point, the military folks that Takeshi was working for before. So they're like, essentially, why not? Let's go ahead and join the envoys. And at this point, Ray has, in the meantime, betrayed the envoys in the past, 250 years ago. She used wealth that she obtained from the Protectorate to be a super powerful meth herself, which is something as envoys they entirely stood against. And she also became a crime lord, which is not entirely shocking, or it shouldn't be, considering she was raised by the Yakuza from a very young age at this point. So Takeshi Kovacs has had a very big turnaround and his personal life at this point. He's had a huge turning point in finding his sister again, and then in meeting Kel and deeply identifying with her as a person and in her mission, whereas Ray is only there because that's where her brother is. That's the only thing that she truly cares about. So she has since returned to being a crime lord. She is employing the same people who initially kidnapped Ortega and Kovacs and tortured them and forced them to fight in the cage matches. And she is multi-sleeved at this point, which we know is highly illegal. She is in a couple of different bodies, just depending on whom she's addressing at the time. I'm not going to tell you which ones are which, just in case, but it's very interesting to see how that is addressed in the show. Takeshi also learns that his sister's desire to essentially achieve immortality led to her entirely sabotaging the envoy shuttle, which killed Kel and her dream to take down the Protectorate to make the wealthy and powerful mortal again. And Ray says that she did all of this to save Takeshi at the time. So he is somewhat horrified that one of the people who he loved most in the world has done this terrible thing and betrayed what he believed to be their shared ideals, to kill all of their friends and to have done that in the name of trying to save him. So he's done some pretty terrible things in his life, some really terrible things, but this is exceptionally horrifying for him at this point. At this point as well, in the current time, Ortega goes to act on Kovacs' orders to figure out how to take out these people who were causing them problems in this crime syndicate. And Kovacs goes to get some help from a dipper who has been incarcerated named Ava. Because remember, dippers are there to hijack different people's memories and everything. They hack into the needle casting system when folks are getting re-sleeved and take their memories. So they partner up with the dipper, Ava, and then they work to try to take up a virus that's going to take out all of the clones that are going on for people who are multi-sleeved. And at the same time, those clones attack Ortega after she infiltrates their storage facility. So that's not great, and Ray is very talented in multi-sleeving and backing herself up. She has her DHF backed up for sure. She has so much money at this point from still re-sleeving for 250 years while her brother was spun down on ice, as they say, So if you imagine a lifespan of, she probably wants to stay young and hot looking forever. So maybe like 35 or something. I don't know. Women should be able to age naturally and gracefully however they want. And we all age differently. But if we assume, because every time we see Ray, she looks to be in her 30s probably, to be about 35, then she's done this like a good, 7 times or so at this point. And that's also just assuming that she hasn't simply, died a lot of times too. She's a crime lord. She may have been murdered a lot at this point. Even if you experience real death as a meth, as she is at this point, she is not actually experiencing real death because she has the DHF backup. So that's not her final copy, even if her stack gets slagged, as they call it. All right, we're going to go on a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to wrap up the end of Season 1 of Altered Carbon.
The GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back. Before the break, we're talking about the series of flashbacks that tell us what happened to Takeshi Kovacs 250 years ago before he was spun down, as well as his interactions with his sister and Kel Falconcrist in the past, and his interactions with his sister and his friend Ortega in the present. At this point, we have gotten to where Ortega has been attacked by Ray, and Ray really backs herself up and re-sleeves herself in Ortega's body. Kovacs does not really understand that or recognize it until it's too late to save Ortega's entire family from the hitman that Ray sends out to them, because she's very, very vindictive as a person. There is a heat and a passion behind everything that Ray does, including and especially the messed up stuff she does. So at this point, her whole family, Ortega's whole family, is taken out, and a lot of them do not believe in re-sleeving. They are portrayed to be Catholics at this point, and they believe that they should be, get their natural deaths, the natural process, the natural order of things. And in that way, we again see more of a likeness to the beliefs of religious folks in the United States nowadays regarding the rights to make your own reproductive choices and where they stand on the moral and ethical boundaries of abortion in general. So, not surprisingly, a lot of folks who are considered to be very religious in this way don't believe in re-sleeving at all. They think that once you die, that should be your real death, and they don't want to even take on a stack at all. So at this point, they're all dead. That's a bummer. But Kovacs does get the opportunity to spread the newly created virus throughout his sister's remaining clones. We see then that Ray has gotten the wife of Lawrence Bancroft, whom Takeshi Kovacs was supposed to study and figure out his murder earlier. He's gotten the wife of Lawrence to drug her husband with a super crazy chemical that makes men erratic and uninhibited and super duper violent. And that led to Lawrence killing a prostitute and sexually assaulting another person who we have seen earlier in the show. Then Lawrence's wife, Miriam, who drugged her husband, and whom the girl ran into while seeking help, killed that girl and dumped her sleeve, but it brainwashed her so that she was stuck in a virtual reality trauma loop until she could be re-sleeved into a new body. So we see that Takeshi is working with that girl's father to try to help her, and so does Poe. Poe takes a special interest in this girl and really wants to help her. So finding out that Lawrence caused the real death of another person and then destroyed his own stack just in time to prevent remembering it, Takeshi at this point is not very sensitive towards Lawrence. He's like, Lawrence is a terrible, terrible person. And we see that Takeshi is down for murdering people, but it seems he draws a line at sexual assault, unlike Lawrence or like the character, the comedian in the Watchmen. So in Watchmen, the comedian is not above anything. We watch him shoot a girl that he's gotten pregnant in Vietnam. At one point, he also assaults the Silk Spectre as well, and is just kind of terrible in general. He is one of the most well-developed characters, though, in the entire graphic novel, and that's why he's one of my favorites. As a person, he is deplorable. As a character, he is very complex and interesting, but that does not make him good, if that makes sense. So Lawrence has done something really terrible in that way as well, but he's more like the comedian, but not exactly. He's just a rich guy who's just getting away with whatever he wants because he can. Whereas Takeshi Kovacs is a mercenary, but he draws a line. He's not as funny as Deadpool. Takeshi does not seem to have a sense of humor at all for the most part. But, in his line of work, I get that. But in this way, if you're drawing a Venn diagram of different folks, that's kind of the mandorla where Takeshi Kovacs would fall. And after you see all of this violence, it was, in the end, just to prevent ratification of a proposition. It's called Proposition 653, and that would have allowed murder victims to be re-sleeved to testify against the people who killed them. So we are seeing this wrap back around to a passing comment that Ortega made at the very beginning of the season when she was talking to Kovacs and they saw the folks who were protesting outside. Ray, as we know at this point, is a crime lord, and she did not want that to come about, because if people were able to be re-sleeved and testify against their killers, then it would cause a lot of problems for her and her criminal organization. She also made money as a crime lord by programming religious coding into murder victims of her clients, so they could not be re-sleeved. So even if they did not initially have those beliefs that say, oh yeah, I don't think I should be re-sleeved, because of the religious properties that are associated with it, the government was ultimately not able to violate those folks' religious rights, even if it was for the greater good of putting down a murderer, especially one that may be associated with a large criminal syndicate, such as Ray's, or someone who may be a serial rapist or murderer at that point. So in that regard, it's very interesting in thinking about how that relates to our own Constitution and the things that occur and get ratified and don't get ratified within the United States because of religious rights and religious means and lobbying in that way. So I think that that's very interesting, and we also see how that can be manipulated to a different type of nefarious purpose. And I think that is also really something I hadn't thought of before, where she is purposely programming them to be religious in her murder victims so that they can't be re-sleeved. Even if they were to make that proposition ratified and allow murder victims to be re-sleeved just to testify against their killers, they would not be able to enforce that on a governmental level if the people were saying they were religious and they did not want to be re-sleeved. So it's super nefarious and very well thought out. I enjoy that the fact that Ray has gone to such calculating lengths to make sure that she's covered. She's fighting this proposition on a political level, a technological level, a religious level, a monetary level, and a criminal level. She is truly taking a holistic perspective as a crime lord and making sure that she can still stay up on top. Even though, as a meth, she's over 250 years old anyway. She doesn't even have to stay on the Earth area or any particular planet. We've established interstellar travel and established earlier in the episodes that there are a bunch of different planets at this point that have humans on them, and she could just go somewhere else and cause more mayhem. But Rey wants what Rey wants, so she doesn't want to have to leave, and instead she is just dealing with this proposition. Although, additionally, the Protectorate is more distributed than just across the globe of Earth at this point. The Protectorate has a lot further reaches, similar to like the Empire in Star Wars. It's a galactic reach, but perhaps not as evil as the Empire, at least not in the super obvious ethnic cleansing ways. So in this way, Rey is a very interesting character to me because she is so multifaceted. She's, again, a terrible person, but she's also a by any means necessary holistic perspective viewer. And we see that she is in that way very similar to Kel, even when their actual ideologies are diametrically opposed. And I really enjoy seeing juxtapositions like that, where it's like, there but for the grace of God, go I, in a manner. It's super cool. I think you guys should definitely check it out. We see that Rey is really trying hard to do these terrible things, but her plan kind of backfires, and the Protectorate passes the proposition. So those murdered prostitutes are re-sleeved, and they get to participate in the trial. And, you know, that's going to affect Bancroft as well. So they do a really good job in weaving all of these issues together. And we see that Kovacs is going to go ahead and spread that virus through Rey's clones. It works, but it also affected his own clone and Poe. So poor Poe is a little bit messed up at this point and is having trouble with glitching. And then the original Kovacs manages to kill Rey before the floating pleasure house in the clouds crashes into the ocean. So up where Lawrence and them were living, so they didn't have to look at the people down below. And then there is, you know, some more going on with Ortega and the cops arresting the meths at that large house. Once we learn about the truth of what happened, Lawrence is in denial that this terrible thing has happened at his hands. That even though, you know, his wife drugged him to where he would do this horrible thing and to assault someone sexually and physically and kill them, he did in fact do it himself. So he turns himself in. And then we see Kovacs bail out the Dipper Ava they worked with earlier, and everything gets righted before Kovacs decides he's going to take off and search for Kel. Now that you're all prepared to watch Season 2 of Altered Carbon, and we have that recap in place, we're going to go ahead and go on a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about a weird sci-fi dream that I had, along with some implications about how the moon may affect our moods in general.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
wrapping up Altered Carbon Season 1's recap, including a lot of the ethical and sociocultural implications and where our characters are at the end of Season 1. So you guys are all prepared to start back on Season 2, as it's been out for about a week and a half or so now, and I really like where it's gone so far with Anthony Mackie playing Takeshi Kovacs' new sleeve. It's a very interesting concept, and it's quite a bit different from Season 1, but it keeps the same basic premise, so it's really going to be easy for you to follow along with it, even though it's taking us into a deeper understanding of the world that Kovacs finds himself in. We get some new characters, some old familiar favorites, and we also get to see Michael Shanks, who is Daniel Jackson in Stargate SG-1, one of my all-time favorite portrayals of an anthropologist on screen, as a character in Season 2 as well. Up next, we're going to go ahead and talk about a weird sci-fi dream I had this week. So, I have nightmares every single night, you guys. Just all the time. That's just who I am as a person. I don't know if it's just anxiety or because I watch a lot of sci-fi and speculative fiction in general, but my dreams tend to get pretty wild. It may also have something to do with majoring in forensic anthropology for so long and working so closely with death a lot, because a lot of my dreams are about death. However, I largely don't find them distressing. It's more just annoying when I wake up in a sweat or I just wake up suddenly and can't sleep very well. A lot of my friends say that they're classic anxiety dreams, but that's neither here nor there. Sometimes the background info changes and sometimes it doesn't. But a lot of my dreams are largely informed by sci-fi and science. So, there's a lot of zombie dreams going on in there. But the other night, I dreamt about the moon coming out of alignment in its proper orbit. And when this happened in the dream, it was set in the present day, and everyone started acting strangely. And I referred to it in my dream as the ultra-scientific term moon madness. So everyone had the moon madness, but no one believed me that it was occurring and that people were going to gradually get more aggressive at that point. Anytime I would tell someone in my dream that it was the moon madness and that we needed to prepare before humans essentially went almost feral, like they still had their wits about them, but they were just going to get more and more aggressive. So not quite zombies, because they weren't quite flesh-eating, more like reavers, where it's just outright violence, but still being a little bit more present cognitively than reavers at that point. I know reavers also do cannibalism, but I digress. Mostly I'm thinking about all the sexual assaults and assault in general that the reavers commit. So in that way, I would try to convince folks, hey, there's something really wrong here. It's the moon madness, and we need to prepare for that. We need to fortify the areas that we're going to be in because this is an apocalyptic scenario and it's going to go sideways real fast. And each time I would try to explain it to anyone, someone would be like, no, everything in space is static. Nothing changes that's that big like that. And I'm like, no, it does, and it can. Earth has a new moon right now that's the size of a Buick. And when I woke up, I realized I had read an article about that recently that came out this past week stating that the Earth has indeed picked up a new moon, more or less, that is in orbit around the Earth, and it is about the size of a car. Is it one of the things that Elon Musk shot into orbit? Perhaps. Probably not. We think it's more of, just a larger body that is orbiting us right now. But that might be partly where the dream came from. It also might be partly because of the lunacy episodes of The Magicians this past week. But my mind kind of composited those things together and turned it into this sci-fi concept that the moon could alter people's behavior and really affect us in a way that could essentially create an apocalyptic scenario where people just go mad without any type of virus or anything that we could really combat. Because you can't put the moon back into its orbital alignment where it should be. It would just be something outside of our control, and you would have to just deal with it. Because it could be gravitational pulls, or it could be associated with geomagnetic issues, or electromagnetism, or it's, especially if you're from the Jack O'Neill school of thought, magnets. It's always magnets for Jack. Or it could just be due to moonlight in general. So in my dream, part of it was about moonlight. So adjusting how much moonlight you were exposed to was going to help mediate the effects of the moon madness. I don't know if the moon was just closer to Earth in its alignment. My brain didn't process that part of it. It was just causing animals and humans to all behave erratically and more aggressively. I also talked about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and I said that she gave me the right to squat in some apartment that I was in. And the lady was like, oh, okay. And then she left. But I don't know what that was about. That was pretty much unrelated. But back to the moon madness. So when I woke up from that, I decided I wanted to Google whether there was any truth about that. So as a woman, I've been told that, the moon can affect my menstrual cycle. I've been told all kinds of stuff like that. I've read about spring and neap tides, which actually is real. So the gravitational pull of the moon and the sun, they both cause tides around the world in our oceans and seas to be different, our spring and our neap tides. And we have those two types twice a month each. One is moderate amounts of the tides, so they're not super duper high or super low. And then the other one is both super high for certain tides and low for other ones. So we're going back and forth as the moon is, changing in its gravitational pull. So the moon and the sun actually cause some of those changes, where the sun kind of moderates part of it from the moon. I thought that was fascinating when I read about that, and they have recently done some studies, particularly with folks who live with bipolar disorder, and found that a lot of their patterns of mania and depression tend to be affected by a lunar cycle. So every 13.7 to 14.8 days, then it may change in these cycles. And any time that there is like a full moon, or a supermoon rather, then it may have other issues associated as well. If you look at people in general, as the collective data, people who have bipolar disorder, there are no obvious patterns. But if you look at long-term longitudinal data of the same folks over time, then you can see that folks either tend to follow the 13.7 day pattern or the 14.8 day pattern. And that does not mean that they are changing from mania to depression every 2 weeks, per se, but rather that when they do, it tends to be within the timing of those lunar tidal cycles as well. I think that that's really interesting to consider, and they've also performed some research in a lot of different animals recently, but also in flies, and have found that exposure to low-frequency electromagnetic fields can reset the timing of fruit flies' circadian clocks, so it can change when they sleep. It's a substance in them called cryptochrome, and cryptochrome binds to light-absorbing molecules called flavin, and that tells your circadian clock that it's daytime, and also triggers a reaction that causes your molecular complex to become magnetically sensitive. It drives your 24-hour circadian rhythms in human cells and tissues, including the brain as well. So that's really fascinating because humans are said to not really have a big geomagnetic component within our bodies, but recent research is really challenging that. They've also found in a 2019 study that when people were exposed to magnetic field changes, equivalent to those we experience as we move around our regular environments, that they experience strong decreases in alpha brainwave activity. Now, alpha waves are produced when we're awake, but we're not really performing any specific task. They're not sure what those changes really mean. It may just be a byproduct of evolution. We may no longer need it, could be irrelevant, or the magnetic changes in our environment may subtly tweak our brain chemistry in ways we're not aware of yet. I think that is super fascinating. And if this cryptochrome change in the fly's circadian clocks also applies to humans, then it could explain why these people who have bipolar disorder are having abrupt mood changes, because the doctors also found that the patients were having fairly dramatic shifts in the timing of their circadian rhythms as they were going through their manic and depressive mood cycles. They also found that they were having dramatic changes in the timing and duration of their sleep. So around certain lunar cycles, people were having trouble going to sleep by an additional 5 minutes, and they were getting 20 minutes less sleep overall throughout the night, as well as about 30% decrease in their deep sleep. That was in some studies that were conducted on folks in just regular sleep studies, and that was around certain lunar cycles. So around a full moon, they were having these problems, even when they removed them from an area in which moonlight could affect them. So they were in a sleep study chamber that did not have any windows. There was no way that the moonlight itself could be affecting these folks. So the researchers are thinking that it may be more of a result of the gravitational pull, just like it affects the tides. I think that that's super fascinating, and we aren't really sure entirely how it works at this point. They say there's not a lot of research that's been conducted so far in this realm, and that they would need a lot of long-term research conducted amongst the same individuals. So over months and months of sleep data in order to get a true accounting of this data for a full study. So cryptochrome is an essential component of our human circadian clock, but it does work differently than the one that fruit flies have. So human and other mammalian cryptochromes don't bind flavin anymore. And without the flavin, we don't know how the magnetically sensitive chemistry could be triggered. So they're studying that in the realm of physics in Teddington, UK. They're also studying that in the US with folks who are dealing with neurobiological and psychological issues. We're just going to have to see a lot more of these types of studies over time, especially interdepartmental studies, to really get a great sense of it. But folks do think that it is possible that the gravitational pull in the moon can affect our moods, and overall, I think that's pretty interesting considering my silly dream about moon madness. But, Mary Shelley started out with Frankenstein as a dream and turned it into a story. So sometimes our dreams can be a really good source of growth for speculative fiction, and sometimes there might be a little bit of science fact in there later on, just like how a lot of that starts out with Star Trek. Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show, and writing a nice review always really helps us. Also, if you could please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, I'd appreciate it. Thank you kindly, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.